In a distant galaxy, far beyond the reaches of Earth, a skilled human mercenary named Jack found himself on an unfamiliar planet. The mission seemed simple enough: collect a bounty for some stolen cargo. But as he entered the planet's bustling capital city, the air felt thick with tension. The once beautiful streets were now filled with an uneasy silence. The people here were no longer free. They were enslaved. Jack didn't want to get involved, but as he passed by a crowded market, something caught his eye. The center of the square had been turned into an auction site. At first, it looked like any other slave auction, something Jack had seen countless times in the outer sectors. But then his gaze locked onto her. She stood tall, her posture regal even under the weight of her chains. Her skin shimmered a deep blue, her eyes fierce yet tired. She was an alien, but she wasn't like the others. Her features were sharp, almost ethereal, and despite being shackled, there was a strength about her that made Jack pause. The auctioneer shouted, pushing the alien woman forward, calling her an exotic rarity that would fetch a high price. She looked up at the crowd with defiance in her eyes, though her face was a mask of pain. The chains rattled as she shifted her weight, but she didn't make a sound. Jack had seen many things in his life, but the sight of this woman stirred something deep inside him. He couldn't just walk away. The injustice burned in him. He approached the auctioneer and, without thinking, offered a price that was far higher than what the alien woman was worth in the market. The auctioneer, seeing a big payout, accepted the bid with a greedy smile. As Jack stepped forward to claim his purchase, the woman's eyes locked onto his. There was no gratitude, no relief, just a cold assessment. Jack was used to being a mercenary, but this moment felt different. He could feel her eyes, not as a slave or an object, but as someone with her own pride, her own will. The chains were removed from her wrists, and she stepped forward, still cautious, still wary. "I don't need your pity," she spoke in a language Jack didn't fully understand, though the emotion behind her words was clear. Jack met her gaze, the weight of his decision settling in. He didn't know why he'd done it. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, or maybe something deeper, but it didn't matter now. "You're free," he said simply. For the first time, the woman's expression softened, but it was brief. She said nothing, but the tension in her body seemed to loosen just a little. Jack turned and led her away from the market, not knowing where this journey would take them. But in that moment, as they walked away from the chaos, one thing was certain: her life was about to change, and so was his. Their path was uncertain, but as the woman followed him, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that their fates were now linked forever. As Jack led the alien woman away from the slave market, the weight of what he had just done settled in. The streets around them were still filled with the harsh sounds of the city's chaos, but for some reason, everything felt quieter now. His pulse was racing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that freeing her was the right thing to do. The woman, whom Jack learned was named Zaria, followed him in silence. She walked with a cautious grace, as if she had learned to move carefully her entire life. Her blue skin shimmered in the dim light, and her eyes, though tired, had a sharp, almost regal quality to them. She was strong. Jack could feel it. She was no ordinary slave. They reached Jack's small, private ship, docked just outside the city's outer limits. The moment they stepped inside, the door closed behind them with a heavy hiss. Zaria looked around, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. She hadn't said a word since they left the auction, and Jack didn't know what to expect. He couldn't speak her language fluently, but he had picked up a few words during his travels. He wasn't sure where to begin. "You're safe now," he said, trying to break the ice. Zaria didn't reply at first. She just stood there, her arms crossed, eyes distant. Jack sighed, leaning against the ship's control panel. "I'm not going to hurt you," he added, though his voice felt small in the silence. He didn't know why he felt the need to explain himself, but it seemed important. Zaria finally turned her gaze to him. Her voice was soft, but her words were heavy. "You don't understand. I wasn't just a slave. I was something more. They took everything from me. Her eyes darkened with a painful memory, and Jack could see the deep scars of her past, even if she didn't say it outright. Jack nodded. He had seen enough pain in his own life to recognize it in others. He didn't have answers for her, but he felt an overwhelming need to help. He wasn't just some mercenary anymore. He was now part of her story, for better or worse. I don't know what happened to you before, Jack said quietly, but from here on, no one's going to treat you like that again. Zaria studied him for a moment, unsure of what to make of his words. Why? She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me. Jack thought about it for a moment. I don't know, he admitted, but I couldn't just stand there and let them do that to you. No one deserves that. Zaria seemed to soften a little at his words, but the walls she had built up over the years were hard to tear down. Jack understood that. She wasn't ready to trust him fully, and maybe she never would be. But that didn't matter to him. He wasn't here for answers. He was here for her, no matter what. The silence between them stretched on, but this time, it didn't feel as heavy. As Jack set the ship's coordinates for the next planet, he glanced over at Zaria. She had turned away, staring out the window, lost in thought. It would take time, but he was willing to give it. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but Jack had a feeling that this wasn't just about saving her anymore. It was about finding something more, together. The journey to the next planet was long and quiet. Zaria sat in the corner of the ship, her arms crossed tightly, her gaze distant. Jack knew she wasn't ready to talk. She wasn't ready to share her past. But it was clear to him that there was more to Zaria than the quiet woman sitting across from him. She was hiding something important. He could see it in the way she carried herself, in the way her eyes flashed with memories she wasn't willing to confront. Jack focused on navigating the ship, trying to give her space. But as the hours stretched into days, he began to wonder, what had she been through? And why was she so closed off? One evening, as they were nearing their destination, Zaria finally broke the silence. She stood up and walked over to the ship's small viewport, looking out at the stars. Her voice was low when she spoke. I wasn't always like this, she said, her tone distant, almost as if she was speaking to herself. I wasn't always a slave. Jack turned his head, surprised. He didn't push her, just waited for her to continue. After a few long moments, Zaria sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. I was a princess, she said, the words heavy with sorrow. The daughter of a queen, of an empire that no longer exists. Jack's eyes widened. A princess. It didn't seem possible. She didn't look anything like a royal. But then again, he didn't know much about alien cultures. I was taken when I was just a child, Zaria continued. My family, they were attacked by a rival faction. I was the only survivor. They enslaved me, sold me off like a piece of property. The weight of her words hit Jack harder than he expected. She had been royalty, a leader of her people, but now she was nothing more than a slave to a powerful empire. It was hard to imagine the pain and loss she must have endured. Zaria paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't even remember my home. My planet was destroyed. My people scattered. The only thing left of my past is the bloodline I carry. Her voice cracked, but she quickly composed herself. Jack stood up and walked over to her. You don't have to be alone in this, he said, his voice firm. You're free now. Whatever happened before, it doesn't define you anymore. Zaria turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. She didn't speak for a long time, but Jack could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she could start over. But there was a part of her that still felt like the slave she had been for so long. Maybe you're right, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know if I can ever truly escape what I was. Jack nodded, understanding more than she knew. He wasn't asking her to forget her past, but he was giving her a chance to rebuild herself, to discover who she really was outside of the chains that had once bound her. Zaria looked out at the stars again, her expression thoughtful. "I didn't choose this life," she said softly, "but maybe I can choose what happens next." Jack watched her, sensing that a shift was happening within her. She wasn't ready to embrace her past, but maybe, just maybe, she was ready to take the first step into the future. And Jack would be there every step of the way. As the days passed, Jack and Zaria's bond grew stronger. They traveled through the stars, finding comfort in each other's company. Though Zaria had revealed a glimpse of her past, she still carried the weight of her royal lineage. Jack noticed the quiet moments when her eyes would drift to the stars, lost in thought. He knew she wasn't just escaping her past, but wrestling with it. And now, with each passing day, Jack felt something was about to change. The sudden beep of the ship's console interrupted the quiet moment. Jack glanced over at the screen, his fingers quickly tapping the controls. A message blinked on the screen. It was a transmission, and the words that followed left Jack stunned. The message was from a group of loyalists, people who still believed in Zaria's bloodline. They had been searching for her ever since her capture. Now, after years of hiding, they had found her. The message was short and to the point. "Return, Zaria. The throne awaits. Only you can restore the empire." Zaria froze as she read the message, her face going pale. Jack could see the conflict in her eyes as the weight of the words sank in. This wasn't just an invitation, it was a summons. Her people needed her. Her past was calling her back. "I can't go back," Zaria whispered, her voice tinged with fear. "I'm not ready. I've been running from that life for so long." Jack stood up and moved closer to her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly. "You have people who believe in you, people who need you, and you have me." Zaria shook her head, her gaze drifting toward the stars again. "But I'm not that person anymore. I've been a slave for so long, Jack. I don't know if I can be the leader they want me to be." Jack's voice was steady, his words filled with conviction. "The person you were before doesn't matter. What matters is who you choose to be now. You don't have to carry the weight of an empire alone. You have a choice." Zaria turned to him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if I fail? What if they don't accept me?" "Then you fight for them," Jack replied firmly. "You fight for your people, for yourself. You've already proven that you're stronger than they ever thought, and I'll be right there with you." Zaria's expression softened as she looked into his eyes. There was a long pause, filled with unspoken words. The choice was hers, but Jack had given her something important, faith in herself, and in the person she could become. She took a deep breath, as if making a decision. "I'll go," she said quietly, her voice resolute. "It's time to face my past. It's time to reclaim what's mine." Jack smiled, proud of her. "You're not alone, Zaria. Let's take it one step at a time." With a sense of determination, Zaria stood up straighter. The call to return had reached her, but it wasn't just her past pulling her back. It was the hope for a future she had almost forgotten. Together, they set the course for her home planet, the place where Zaria would begin her journey back to who she was meant to be, a queen, but more importantly, a leader. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Zaria felt ready to face whatever came next. The journey back to Zaria's home planet was long, but it gave her time to prepare. Each day, she spent hours reviewing old records and practicing her language. The memories of her home, of the palace she had once known, felt like distant dreams. The woman who had been sold into slavery was no longer the same person who had once ruled a vast empire. But Zaria knew she had to return. When the ship finally entered the planet's atmosphere, the excitement in Zaria's chest was mixed with fear. As they descended into the thick clouds, the planet below looked different. The once great kingdom was now reduced to ruins. Buildings that had once stood tall and proud now crumbled into dust. There were no signs of life in the city below. Only remnants of a lost civilization remained. Jack looked at Zaria, his expression soft but filled with concern. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked gently. Zaria didn't answer right away. She just stared out of the window, watching the destruction below. The palace, where she had spent her childhood, was little more than a broken shell of its former self. The once beautiful gardens were overgrown with weeds, and the great halls were filled with shadows. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready," she finally said, her voice quiet and heavy. "But I have to do this. For my people." As the ship landed softly on the ground, Zaria took one last look at the ruins of her past. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew that this was where her journey would truly begin. Stepping out of the ship, the air was cold and heavy, like the planet itself had been mourning for years. The Loyalists had given her hope, but now it was time to see if they were still there. Jack followed closely behind, his hand resting on his blaster. Though he wasn't sure what lay ahead, he was ready to protect her, no matter what. The streets of the city were eerily quiet. There was no sign of life, but Zaria knew her people were somewhere, waiting for her. They had sent the message after all. The Loyalists were still fighting to restore the Empire, her empire. "I don't even know where to begin," Zaria murmured, her eyes scanning the empty streets. "We start with the people who still believe in you," Jack said, his voice firm with resolve. "They're here somewhere. We'll find them." Zaria nodded, but doubt lingered in her eyes. She wasn't sure if she could trust her own memories of this place. She had been gone for so long, and everything had changed. The once thriving city was now a ghost of what it had been. They walked through the streets, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Zaria's heart pounded in her chest as they neared the palace. The once great building was now covered in vines, its walls cracked and broken. The doors that had once welcomed royalty were now barely standing. When they reached the palace, Zaria's breath caught in her throat. This was where it had all begun. This was where her life had been shattered. But now, it was the place where she would begin to rebuild. "We'll fix this," Jack said, his voice steady. "Together." Zaria looked up at the crumbling palace. It was time to face her past, but it was also time to restore her future. The road ahead would not be easy, but with Jack by her side, she felt like she could finally begin again. Zaria stood at the top of the palace stairs, looking out at the remnants of her once great kingdom. The Loyalists who had awaited her return gathered below, their faces filled with both hope and fear. They had been living in the shadows for years, struggling to survive under the rule of the usurper. But now, with Zaria back, there was a flicker of hope in their eyes. She had returned, and so had the chance to reclaim what was rightfully hers. Jack stood by her side, his hand resting on the hilt of his blaster. He was ready for whatever came next, but he could sense Zaria's unease. She was no longer the scared slave she once was, but she wasn't yet the queen she needed to be. She had to lead these people, and it was clear that the burden of that responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders. "We can't waste any more time," Zaria said quietly, turning to Jack. "We have to act quickly. The usurper won't wait for us to regroup." Jack nodded. "We'll take it one step at a time. You've already proven yourself by coming back. Now let's build from there." Zaria took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the edge of the stone railing. It was a small, simple gesture, but it helped ground her. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had Jack, and she had the Loyalists who still believed in her. Together, they could do this. The first step was to unite the scattered groups of Loyalists who had been hiding in different parts of the planet. Some were ex-soldiers, others were civilians, but they all shared one thing in common. They'd wanted to see Zaria on the throne again, and Zaria was determined to honor their faith in her. Over the next few days, they worked quickly, using old underground communication channels to send out messages. They planned raids on key supply routes controlled by the usurper's forces. Zaria, with Jack's help, began to train the Loyalists, teaching them tactics that would give them an edge in battle. While they were outnumbered, Their knowledge of the land and the old empire's fighting strategies gave them a surprising advantage. Zarya pushed herself harder than anyone. She worked alongside the Loyalists, leading missions and learning from Jack's expertise in combat. She wasn't just a figurehead. She was becoming the leader her people needed. Each day, she grew stronger, more confident. But she still had doubts. Was she truly capable of leading an entire empire? Could she overcome the mistakes of her past? Jack noticed the change in her. She no longer flinched when speaking to her people. Her voice, once shaky and uncertain, was now filled with conviction. But Jack also saw the moments when her confidence wavered. In those moments, he made sure to be there for her, to remind her that they were in this together. The first raid was a success. They took back a key outpost that had been under the usurper's control for years. Zarya's heart raced as they captured the enemy soldiers, but her mind stayed clear. This victory, though small, showed her that she was capable of leading this fight. They had taken the first step toward restoring her kingdom, and with each success, Zarya's resolve grew stronger. As the days passed, the Loyalists rallied behind her, their spirits lifting with each victory. Zarya knew the battles ahead would be much harder, but for the first time since her return, she believed in herself. And with Jack by her side, she knew they could take on whatever came next. The rebellion had begun, and Zarya was no longer just a princess. She was the queen her people had been waiting for. The months of training and small victories had led to this moment. Zarya's forces had grown stronger, their numbers swelling as more loyalists joined their cause. The usurper's control over the planet was weakening, but the final confrontation was inevitable. Zarya knew that to reclaim her throne, she would have to face the one who had stolen it from her, the general who had taken everything from her and her people. The night before the final battle, Zarya stood alone outside the palace, staring out at the ruined city. The stars above seemed to shimmer with a promise that she could reclaim what was hers. But even as her heart filled with determination, there was a part of her that felt unsure. She wasn't just fighting for a throne anymore. She was fighting for the future of her people, for everything they had lost. Jack stood a few steps behind her, his presence a steady comfort. He didn't speak at first, knowing that Zarya needed the quiet, but he could feel the weight of the moment. They both knew that the next day would change everything. "You don't have to do this alone," Jack said finally, his voice soft. Zarya turned to face him, her eyes filled with both strength and fear. "I know," she said quietly, "but I have to do this. I can't keep running." Jack nodded. "You've come so far. You're not the same woman who was sold into slavery. You're a queen, and tomorrow you'll show them that." Zarya's gaze softened, but she didn't smile. She had never truly felt like a queen. Not until now. But as she stood in front of Jack, she realized that he was right. The time had come to face her destiny, and she wasn't doing it alone. The next morning, the final battle began. Zarya's army faced the usurper's forces outside the crumbling palace. It was a battle unlike any other. The Loyalists were outnumbered, but they fought with a ferocity that surprised the usurper's soldiers. Zarya stood at the front of the line, leading them with the strength she had found within herself. Her people followed her, not out of fear, but because they believed in her. The usurper's army was strong, but they weren't prepared for the determination of Zarya and her people. The battle raged on, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Jack fought by Zarya's side, keeping the usurper's soldiers at bay while she led the charge. The sound of weapons clashing, the cries of the wounded, it was all a blur to Zarya. All she could think about was the fight ahead and the man who had taken everything from her. Finally, after what felt like hours, Zarya found herself face to face with the usurper. The general stood tall, his armor shining in the sunlight, a cruel smirk on his face. He had once been her protector, her father's trusted ally. But now he was the very thing standing between her and her rightful place as queen. "You think you can take everything back?" The usurper sneered, his voice cold. Zaria's eyes narrowed as she gripped her weapon tightly. "I already have," she said, her voice steady. "And now, I'm taking my throne." With a cry, Zaria charged at the usurper. Their swords clashed in a shower of sparks. The fight was brutal, each strike filled with years of pain and loss. But Zaria fought with a strength she hadn't known she had. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her people, for the future of her world. In the end, Zaria's blade found its mark. With one swift motion, she struck the usurper down. The battle was over. The loyalists cheered, but Zaria didn't celebrate. She stood over the fallen usurper, her chest heaving with exhaustion. She had done it. She had taken back what was hers. Jack approached her, his eyes filled with pride. "You did it," he said quietly. Zaria looked up at him, her face hard but her heart full. "We did it," she corrected him. Together, they had won. And now, together, they would rebuild what had been lost. Zaria was no longer just a princess. She was the queen her people had been waiting for. The victory was hard-earned, but it was finally theirs. Zaria stood in the heart of the palace, her gaze sweeping over the ruins that had once been a symbol of power and glory. The walls, though damaged, still held memories of a time when her family ruled with kindness and strength. Now those memories were being rebuilt, just as she was. The loyalists, the people who had stood by her when no one else did, were beginning the long work of restoring the kingdom. The palace was the first priority. Workers were clearing away debris, and the sounds of hammers and chisels echoed through the halls. Zaria watched them with a quiet determination. The place might be broken, but it was her home, and she would make sure it stood tall again. Jack stood beside her, watching as the people worked. His role had shifted since they had arrived on the planet. No longer just a mercenary, he had become a trusted advisor to Zaria. The two of them had shared countless hours planning, organizing, and leading the rebellion. And now they were faced with a different challenge: rebuilding a broken empire. "How does it feel?" Jack asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Zaria glanced at him, her eyes soft but serious. "It's overwhelming," she admitted. "But it's also freeing. I'd spent so many years in chains, thinking I would never get back what was taken from me. But now I see the future. My people are looking to me for leadership." Jack nodded, understanding the weight of her words. She had spent so long fighting for freedom, for survival, that she had never truly allowed herself to think about what would come after. But now she had the chance to create something new, to make her people's future better than it had been before. Zaria turned her attention to the bustling workers and the steady rebuilding of the palace. "We had a lot of work ahead of us," she said, her voice steady. "But we're not doing it alone. I know my people are strong, and we've learned so much from this rebellion. I'll make sure our empire is built on trust, on fairness." Jack smiled at her. "You've already shown them that you're the leader they need. You've proven that you're ready." Zaria's eyes darkened slightly, but there was no hesitation in her voice. "I have to be. I can't let the mistakes of the past happen again." As the days passed, Zaria worked tirelessly alongside the people of the empire. She wasn't just sitting on a throne, issuing orders. She was out there, in the streets, helping to rebuild, listening to her people, learning about their struggles. She wanted to ensure that every voice was heard, that no one would be left behind. The loyalty of her people was her greatest strength. The planet, once a place of fear and oppression under the usurper, was beginning to feel like home again. The streets were no longer filled with fear, but with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and hope. Zaria knew that the hard work was far from over, but she could see the change happening before her eyes. Jack, always by her side, helped her navigate the complexities of leadership. Together, they formed a council made up of both the old loyalists and new allies, making sure that all parts of the empire had a voice in the decisions that were being made. The work was never easy, but Zaria felt the weight of her crown growing lighter as the days went on. She wasn't just ruling. She was leading with her people, guiding them to a new future. For the first time in years, Zaria allowed herself to feel the spark of something she had long thought lost: hope. The empire was not just being restored physically, it was being restored in spirit too. And as she stood in the heart of the palace once more, she knew that she was not alone. Together with Jack and the people who believed in her, Zaria was ready to build a future that would honor the legacy of her family and create a new legacy for those to come. The sun set over the restored palace, casting a warm, golden glow on the vast gardens that had been carefully tended over the past few months. Zaria stood on the balcony, looking out at the city below. The streets, once dark and empty, were now full of life. Children ran and played in the open spaces, their laughter filling the air. People worked together to rebuild, side by side, with a renewed sense of purpose and hope. Zaria had always imagined what it would feel like to return to her home, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality. The planet, though scared by years of oppression, was slowly healing, and it was because of the people, her people, who had stood by her side through every challenge. She was no longer the girl who had been torn from her home and sold into slavery. She had found herself again, and with the help of those around her, she had found her purpose. Behind her, Jack stood, silently watching the sunset with her. He had been with her every step of the way, from the moment they had met in the slave market to the many battles they had fought together. He had never asked for anything in return, always content to support her and her people. Zaria had come to rely on him, not just as a warrior, but as a true partner, someone she could trust with her life and her kingdom. "I still can't believe it," Zaria said softly, her voice full of wonder. "It's like a dream." Jack smiled, but his eyes were serious. "It's not a dream, Zaria. It's reality. You've earned every moment of this." Zaria turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said quietly. "I was lost, Jack. I didn't know who I was, or who I could be. But you believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Jack stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You always had it in you. I just helped you see it." She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. There were still challenges ahead. The empire was far from fully healed. There were systems to rebuild, laws to reestablish, and countless lives to repair. But Zaria knew that the foundation was strong now. She had the support of her people, and together they would build a future that would honor the legacy of her ancestors and bring peace to those who had suffered for so long. As the last rays of sunlight faded behind the mountains, Zaria and Jack stood in comfortable silence, their hearts full of unspoken understanding. The journey had been long and hard, but they had made it through. They had reclaimed her throne, and in doing so, had forged a new path for the future. Zaria's thoughts turned to the work that lay ahead. She had to lead with wisdom, compassion, and strength. But most of all, she had to remember that she was not alone. Jack, the loyalists, and the people of the empire were all with her. They were all part of this new beginning. "We'll take it one day at a time," Zaria said, more to herself than to Jack. "But we'll rebuild it all, together." Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, his presence a constant, reassuring force. "Together," he agreed. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Zaria knew that the hardest part was over. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with the strength of her people and the support of the one person who had always believed in her, she was ready for whatever came next. This was her new beginning, and she would face it with courage, wisdom, and the unwavering belief that together they could overcome anything. The empire was changing. The streets, once filled with the dust of despair, now gleamed with the promise of a brighter future. New buildings were rising, and the marketplace buzzed with life. People from every corner of the planet had come together to rebuild, not just their homes but their hopes. The planet, scared and broken, was slowly being restored to its former glory. Zaria could feel it in the air, the energy of a world coming back to life. She stood at the top of the palace steps, her eyes scanning the city below. The work was far from over, but they had made incredible progress. Her people were no longer just surviving. They were thriving. Zeria had always dreamed of leading her people, but she hadn't known it would feel like this. It wasn't about the throne or the power anymore. It was about something more. The people, the land, the future they were all building together. Jack stood beside her, as always. He had become more than just a warrior by her side. He had become a friend, a confidant. Their bond had grown stronger over the months. And now, as she looked out at the city, Zeria knew that it wasn't just her kingdom she was rebuilding. It was her life, her purpose, and the future she would share with those she loved. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Zeria asked, her voice soft but filled with wonder. "From the slave market to this." Jack smiled, his eyes warm as he looked at her. "I think about it every day. You've done something no one thought possible. You've brought hope to a broken world." Zeria shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "We've done it, together. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Jack." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. "You've always had the strength, Zeria. I just helped you find it." She nodded, her gaze turning back to the city. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the buildings and streets. It was a beautiful sight, one that she would never take for granted. It had taken everything to get here, every sacrifice, every loss. But in the end, it had been worth it. As the days passed, Zeria took on her role as queen with confidence. She worked alongside the council, making decisions that would shape the future of her empire. The people trusted her, not because of her title, but because of who she had become. She wasn't just a leader, she was one of them. She understood their struggles, their hopes, and their dreams. She would fight for them, just as they had fought for her. The nights in the palace were quiet now. Zeria spent her evenings walking the halls, lost in thought, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. There were still challenges ahead, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced the worst of her past and had come out stronger. She knew that, no matter what, she would always have the support of those who believed in her. One evening, as she stood looking out at the stars, Jack joined her. They stood side by side, their hearts filled with the same hope that had driven them to this point. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Zeria was ready to face it. She wasn't just reclaiming a throne. She was building a new legacy, one that would endure for generations to come. Together, with Jack by her side, Zeria knew they would face whatever came next. They had already overcome the impossible. Now, they would create a future that no one had ever dared to dream of. The empire would rise, stronger than ever, and Zeria would lead it with the strength of a true queen.